Oh, hi there. Well, it's that time of the year again, the holidays. And for folks like me, it can be a tough time of the year. You know you want to get a gift for someone, but it's hard to know what that should be. Maybe I can give you a hand with that. Let me tell you a little bit about Fxllxng. Founded in Austria as a small family-owned business, they've grown to produce an array of fine products. Take this bracelet, for example. Tiger's eye and lava. It could make a slick gift. And that's just a small fraction of the jewelry options they offer. But I really want to bring your attention towards their many beautiful watches. One of the best gifts I ever received was a watch. Many folks don't realize how much they appreciate having a watch until they actually get one. These watches come wonderfully presented in their own wooden box. Just open it to reveal the superb craftsmanship. This watch is the San Francisco, made of zebra wood and maple. It is just one of countless options available from Fxllxng. I guarantee you will find something you'll like, and you could spend a lot of time just scrolling through the many styles. So if you're looking to find the perfect gift this holiday season, give Fxllxng a try. So follow the link in the description and use code Enigma15 for a 15% discount on your purchase. Fxllxng guarantees delivery by Christmas on all orders placed up until December 21st, so don't delay. Hey there folks, in this video we're going to talk about a case that I've been wanting to revisit for quite some time, and that case is the disappearance of Charles McCullar in Crater Lake National Park. It's a case I've been working on for a long time, trying to figure out what happened. The first video I ever uploaded on this channel was about Charles McCullar, and I cringe in pain every time I think back on it. But the more we do something, the more we grow, and hopefully we get better or refined techniques in the areas that need it. It was basically the missing 411 version of the story, and that version kind of goes something like this. Charles McCullar travels to Crater Lake National Park on January 29, 1975, with the intention of taking photographs and camping in the area. The park is very beautiful in the winter. He was supposed to return in 3 days, and if he wasn't back by February 1st, a friend was supposed to call the police. Well, obviously the worst happened, or we wouldn't be talking about it. Charles never returned. A search for Charles began, and once his father was informed of the disappearance, he made it his mission to find his son at all costs. Unfortunately, nothing of much significance was found during that initial search. In fact, it wasn't until the next year, 1976, when some hikers were in a very remote region on the western side of the park near Bybee Creek, that something was found. The hikers found a backpack, which seemed suspicious, so they removed a few items and left the area. Later, they turned them over to park personnel, or more specifically, a ranger named Marion Jack. Marion noticed that one of the items was a key, and he recognized the key as an item known to be in Charles McCullar's possession when he went missing. Afterwards, Marion and another ranger, Dave Lang, went out to find the spot of the backpack near Bybee Creek, and find it they did. The vast majority of the Charles McCullar lore comes from what happens next, and what happens next is almost entirely based on an interview David Paulides, the author of Missing 411, did with former Crater Lake Ranger Marion Jack many years after the incident. During the interview with Paulides, Ranger Marion described finding the scene fairly quickly because the hikers had hung clothing from a tree branch in order to make it easy to find. He says they walked down into a bowl-type area, with a creek running in one end and out the other. It wasn't until Ranger Marion walked over a large fallen tree that he saw a pair of pants on the other side. Ranger Marion offered this description of what those pants looked like, and he said they appeared as if you were standing straight up and melted straight down into your pants. The belt buckle and the button on the pants were also undone. He then found a broken tibia or fibula, which is one of the bones in the lower part of the leg, and it was located in the right leg of the pants. Under the pants were a pair of socks that had small foot bones still inside. Charles' boots were nowhere to be found. Later, they discovered Charles' skull lying nearby. They were also able to find some other small bones and items in the immediate area. Ranger Marion told Paulides that he couldn't understand why the boots were missing, why the pants were undone, or why there weren't more large bones found nearby. After all this, the death of Charles McCullar was determined to be an accident. An active investigation into the case stopped despite protestations from Charles' father, Charles McCullar Sr. Now, I would not blame you if you heard that story and felt that all the details amounted to something strange or possibly even paranormal. I can't blame you because I felt that way once. The way the scene is described seems very bizarre, particularly with the metaphor of someone melting straight down into their pants. All of this strangeness is likely compounded by the fact that the official report for this case, which was the National Park Service report, no longer exists. This is a fact I can confirm is true, as the NPS told me the same thing. So basically, nobody has been able to read the original report written by Rangers Marion Jack and Dave Lang. All we have to go on is Marion Jack's interview with David Paulides. Now, as you might expect from the fact that I am making another video about this case, what you just heard is far from the full detailed story of Charles McCullar. And that is not to say that the story I just told you is necessarily wrong, it is just lacking some critical context. Once we go over some of this additional information, you might find that this case, which you once thought was unexplainable, is anything but. Or maybe not. We'll see. First, though, we have to go back to the beginning. Charles Wood McCullar was originally from Alexandria, Virginia, and during the time of his expedition in 1975, he was 19 years of age. He stood at 6'3" and about 150 pounds. For the prior year and a half, Charles worked as an electronics and printing technician. He was very fond of camping and hiking, and when traveling, he preferred to sleep outside rather than in a motel. He was known to his family to be a responsible young adult who was never belligerent and never used drugs. At the time of his leaving for the West Coast, he was simply looking forward to a well-earned vacation of traveling, hiking, and taking lots of pictures. The trip was planned as a 60-day bus and hiking tour of the U.S. national parks. Charles McCullar's journey began on January 8th of 1975. He left his itinerary and phone numbers with his family so that they could be in touch as much as possible. Charles would call his parents 3 times during his trip, twice from Yuma, Arizona on January 16th and the 22nd, and once from Eugene, Oregon on January 27th. This part of his trip was a 4-day stay in Eugene in order to visit a friend, Dorothy Weirn. While staying in Eugene, he told Dorothy that he was going to Crater Lake for the weekend of January 29th, and he planned to return by February 1st. While there, Charles intended to take pictures of the lake and the surrounding areas, which are quite breathtaking in the winter. Charles was prepared for this leg of the trip in terms of both gear and experience. He carried plenty of cold weather clothing, including a sleeping bag rated for temperatures 25 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. He had a black tarp for creating shelter and enough food to last the duration of his trip. At the time, Dorothy's understanding was that Charles would be taking a bus south to Roseburg, and then he would hitchhike from there to Crater Lake, which lies to the east. At this time of the year, Crater Lake is typically covered in a deep layer of snow, and the winter of 1975 was no different. Every year, the park receives over 40 feet of snowfall, and in January of 1975, there was 8 to 10 feet of snow on the ground in some areas. When Charles failed to return from his trip after 3 nights, Dorothy reported him missing on February 1st, like she promised. The scope of the search for Charles McCullar was quite large because of a lack of certainty regarding Charles's movements. This caused the involvement of multiple sheriff's offices, state police, the National Forest Service, and of course, the National Park Service. Some searched the road heading east from Roseburg, while others searched within the park boundaries without any idea of where Charles would have gone upon entering the park from the north. The search involved CREST, the Cascade Rescue Emergency Search Team, and also multiple snowmobiles, trucks, airplanes, and helicopters. Forest Service and National Park Rangers made numerous search attempts on foot and using skis. Weather hampered their search efforts, of course, as 80 inches of fresh snow fell the weekend after Charles disappeared. Sadly, Charles' family was not informed of his disappearance until February 10th, about 10 days after he was overdue. From that point forward, Charles's father, who for simplicity's sake we shall call Mr. McCullar, took an active role in pushing the search and investigation into his son's disappearance. Within the park itself, the search almost exclusively took place in the northern section, because it was assumed Charles entered through there. During the winter, the northern entrance is actually closed and typically only accessed by those on snowmobiles. The southern entrance is where everyone else goes because it is still open. So authorities believed it was most likely Charles entered through the north, simply because of proximity. To get to the south entrance, he would have had to hitchhike another 40 miles around the lake. This assumption likely had a negative impact on the outcome of this search, in my opinion. But with the search ongoing, investigators were out looking for anyone who might have witnessed Charles in the park or traveling to it. One of the first tips investigators received about Charles was a sighting at the Dry Creek store at 7:30 a.m. on January 29th. This location is about halfway between Roseburg and Crater Lake, along the section of road that Charles was planning to hitchhike. This information comes from the state police, who fed it to a newspaper to write the article. Why do I mention that? Because we are already going to get into some timeline wonkiness, since Mr. McCullar claims in letters he wrote to authorities that Charles was seen at the Dry Creek store at 6:30 p.m. Again, one source saying he was seen at 7:30 a.m., another saying 6:30 p.m. Almost a 12-hour difference there. These kinds of discrepancies from varying sources are going to pop up on a number of occasions. Why? Because Mr. McCullar essentially ran his own investigation and was often in communication with authorities about his opinions and conclusions related to this case. Most, if not all, of these letters still exist, and they will often be referenced in this video. Anyway, another sighting came from a log trucker who picked up someone who very much matched Charles' description on the North Umpqua Highway on the morning of January 30th. The assumption being, I suppose, that Charles camped out somewhere on the side of the road the night before, perhaps at the Dry Creek store. The log trucker stated that the young hitchhiker said he was from Virginia, and that he was traveling from Eugene to Crater Lake with the intention of taking pictures at the park. The trucker said that the young man was wearing a down-filled jacket and carrying a camera. Sounds a lot like Charles. The truck eventually let him out at Stump Lake, about 20 miles from Crater Lake itself, and he was last seen by the truck driver heading east. At the time, there was roughly 30 inches of snow on the roadside, but the weather was clear. Those are the two sightings of Charles that are the most legitimate, and they indicate that he was making slower progress in reaching Crater Lake than he probably intended. Given his path of travel, it seems likely that the next location Charles would stop would be a place called the Diamond Lake Resort. The resort sits to the north of the park itself, and it was investigated to find out if Charles might have turned up there at some point. The location is a popular tourist destination, even in winter. The owner of the Diamond Lake Resort, John Koch, turned over a list of everyone who registered at Diamond Lake the weekend Charles disappeared. Newspapers reported that no one who was contacted ever recalled seeing a man matching Charles McCullar's description arrive there over the course of that weekend. Mr. McCullar flew into Oregon on February 19th to assist in the search for his son. He flew over the search area multiple times in order to understand the land. When nothing was found, he returned after winter snows melted and spent weeks hiking and searching for anything. It was this lack of finding any equipment or remains that caused Mr. McCullar to begin considering the possibility of foul play. He could not imagine a scenario where his son, an experienced outdoorsman, could just vanish without a trace. Authorities, for their part, say they never found any evidence to indicate foul play. Charles McCullar was just a man who went missing in the frigid and snow-covered park. To them, everything pointed to accidental death. Because of this, the formal search for Charles McCullar ended, though without a body, his case would remain open. During the time that Charles McCullar was missing, and after the formal search had ended, There were a number of reported sightings, which is pretty typical. For the sake of thoroughness, I'll talk about them briefly. One came from a 16-year-old girl who was camping with her family in the Diamond Lake area around July 6, 1975, about 5 months after Charles disappeared. The girl met a young man who told her that he was also camping at the lake. He claimed that he was from Virginia and that he had hitchhiked all the way there. She noticed his hiking boots were well worn, and he advised that he was going to head down to Crater Lake soon and camp there. She said he had a camera around his neck, but was unsure of the make of it. She described him as 5'8", medium build, and about 20 years old with a gap between his front teeth. He told her that he was camping by himself, although she never saw his campsite or any of his gear. No other family members of the girl saw this man except for her younger brother, who was 5 at the time. 10 days after this incident, another woman claimed to have picked up Charles McCullar and another individual who were hitchhiking. The woman claimed it was either Charles or his twin brother. Again, while I am mentioning these tips here, they are quite commonplace in these types of incidents, and are usually misidentifications or complete fabrications. So to be clear, the best evidence we have of Charles's movements are that he took a bus to Roseburg on January 29th and was seen at the Dry Creek store that same day, likely after hitching a ride. On January 30th, a log truck picks him up and takes him as far as Stump Lake. What the timeline looks like after that is uncertain. Moving on, we have to talk about Charles McCullar's father. He wrote a lot of letters to authorities, and they provide a lot of insight. To begin with, Mr. McCullar had a lot of issues with the way the investigation into his son's disappearance and death was conducted, and for the most part he brings up a lot of fair points, mostly having to do with authorities being slow to check up on leads or seemingly ignoring potential leads. No authority investigating this case saw enough evidence to pursue an investigation into foul play. Because of this, Mr. McCullar wrote a lot of letters to people in high places, senators, governors, superintendents, etc. He was often in touch with the FBI and state police, pushing them to investigate a foul play angle on the case. Unfortunately for him, these letters accomplished very little. One interesting point he makes relates to Charles's movements on the days he was known to be traveling to Crater Lake. As you might recall from earlier, there was a witness who saw Charles at the Dry Creek store about 47 miles east of Roseburg at 7:30 a.m. on January 29th. The information was printed in newspapers, but comes directly from state police, who were feeding the newspapers this information to drum up witnesses. Mr. McCullar has a completely different understanding of this part of the story. He claims that Charles would have taken a bus that arrived in Roseburg at 3:51 p.m., and says that Charles was seen at the Dry Creek store at about 6:30 p.m. Why the discrepancy and which one is right? I can't really say, as both times are odd for their own reasons. All records regarding Charles's bus pass were not kept by the Greyhound Bus Company, so there is no certainty here. Greyhound only retained these records for 7 to 10 days before destroying them. That was just their way of doing things. So authorities would have had to ask for the records by February 4th to the 7th. Instead, they only got around to it on the 19th, by which time the records were destroyed. The idea that Charles was seen at the Dry Creek store at 7:30 a.m. seems strange, because a truck driver presumably dropped him off at Stump Lake the next day. So, what would Charles have been doing for the entire day of the 29th? Our other option isn't much better, as Mr. McCullar's time frame of Charles being at the store at 6:30 p.m. seems completely unreasonable. If you are intending to travel from Eugene to Crater Lake in the same day in order to camp, you would be a fool to leave Eugene in the afternoon, especially knowing that you would have to hitchhike part of the way. If Mr. McCullar's time frame is to be believed, then Charles would have left Eugene at around 2:30 p.m., and it would have been dark by the time he started walking into Crater Lake. It doesn't really make sense, and I can't see an experienced hiker or camper doing it this way. But if a log truck driver picked him up the next morning on January 30th and dropped him off at Stump Lake, then I guess it did happen that way. Now, one of Mr. McCullar's first foul play theories that he brings up is his belief that whoever gave Charles the ride to the Dry Creek store is quite possibly the key to his disappearance. He notes that Charles was seen there with a tear in his jacket. Mr. McCullar also sometimes states in his letters that there has never been any explanation for how Charles traveled these 47 miles. But we know he intended to hitchhike this part of the journey, so what alternative was there? In other letters, Mr. McCullar even acknowledges that his son must have hitchhiked this distance, because he states that for his son to leave a ride which would take him closer to his destination would have required behavior on the part of the other occupants of the vehicle that was offensive to him. He goes on to say that the two actions that would be most objectionable to Charles would have been homosexual advances and/or drug or narcotics usage. Mr. McCullar confidently states that none of the people who live in the area gave him a lift because he spoke with all of them, and this must mean that whoever gave Charles the ride was heading further up the road. So why didn't they take Charles? While there is, in fact, a host of other reasons Charles may have gotten out at the Dry Creek store. If this sighting did take place at 6:30 p.m., then maybe Charles thought it would be a good stopping point, as it was already getting dark. Maybe the driver was stopping in the area for something like camping, but didn't live there. There are plenty of other possible reasons, but Mr. McCullar chose to fixate on the ones that would possibly lead to foul play. But let's say he's right, that this driver did something offensive. The idea that after the two parted, this driver stayed in the area to stalk and murder Charles seems kind of ridiculous. Mr. McCullar also seems to be unaware of a contradiction in his logic here, as he acknowledges in later writings that a log truck driver picked Charles up and dropped him off at Stump Lake. That driver would have taken Charles 20 miles east and left him still another 20 miles short of his destination. But Mr. McCullar never seemed to question why Charles got out of the log truck at Stump Lake. Why wasn't the log truck driver the new prime suspect? I would hope that he realized that this is somewhat the nature of hitchhiking. You go only as far as the driver goes. I don't mean to sound crass. I can see why Mr. McCullar was concerned about these points, but we also have to remember that these drivers probably had reasons for taking Charles as far as they did. Take the log truck driver, for example. The area around Crater Lake is still an active logging area to this day. There are many forest roads around the area of Stump Lake, and it seems like it could very well be a possibility that the driver had to get off the highway here. I mean, the truck driver said he last saw Charles walking east, which kind of, in a way, implies he was driving in a different direction. Eventually, Mr. McCullar seems to acknowledge that Charles must have made it as far as Diamond Lake, but yet another point of contention he brought up was in regard to the list of Diamond Lake Resort patrons provided by the owner of the establishment. Mr. McCullar indicated that he contacted all 88 people on that list, and also that many of them were registered after Friday, January 31st. Mr. McCullar felt that this made the list incomplete, and he is right about that. It might not have been a complete list of those people who stayed at Diamond Lake from January 29th to February 1st. Then again, it could have been complete, as I doubt there were many people registering before the weekend. Mr. McCullar also seemed to be under the impression that no police ever contacted anyone on that list, although a newspaper did indicate that at least some of these patrons were contacted by police, and none of them reported seeing Charles. Which one is correct about this, I can't really say. Mr. McCullar also wanted authorities to look into the backgrounds of all 88 Diamond Lake patrons and determine if any of them had a criminal past. State Police did respond to the request by telling him that, in the absence of some evidence indicating one or more of these Diamond Lake patrons were somehow connected with Charles's disappearance, they, the investigators, did believe, and I concur, that such an unwarranted invasion was inappropriate. Simply because a person might have some criminal offense in his past does not mean that he was connected to your son's disappearance. In an effort to get the FBI involved in the investigation into his son's disappearance, Mr. McCullar would use this statement and take it completely out of context in a later letter he wrote to the FBI, saying, "The state of Oregon took the position that it was inappropriate and unwarranted to interview persons known to be at and going to and from Diamond Lake to try to gather information. In reality, As we just read, the statement he took that from was in relation to performing background checks on patrons and using past criminal offenses to target random suspects. It was not about the state police saying they shouldn't interview patrons. You see, Mr. McCullar now believed it to be a real possibility that Charles made it to the Diamond Lake Resort. As he puts it, it was one of the few places Chuck could have conceivably gotten off the road, with snow conditions as they were. He did not believe that Charles would have registered there, but instead would have camped out nearby. Mr. McCullar believed that it was the most plausible that Charles tried the north entrance to Crater Lake first, before turning back because of the snow. Therefore, it would have been late on Thursday, January 30th, before he made it back to the Diamond Lake area. Mr. McCullar writes that an employee of the Diamond Lake Resort recalled seeing a young fellow come in late one night around that date and ask how far it was around the lake. Mr. McCullar thought this might have been his son. This possible sighting is dubious at best because we have no certain date on which it occurred, and the only reason Mr. McCullar thought it might be his son is because he felt Charles would ask that type of question. But let's say it was Charles. Why would he ask that question? Could it be because he wanted to know how far it was to get to the south entrance? Regardless, because of this sighting and a lack of any other clues, Mr. McCullar believed that the police should be contacting anyone known to have been at Diamond Lake at this time. And I suppose the driver who gave Charles a ride to the Dry Creek store must still have slowly been stalking him in his vehicle during this time. Mr. McCullar did admit that, although he believed there to be foul play, he could not imagine a motive for such a thing. He openly questioned authorities about where someone would even dispose of a body in the middle of winter. An open well, an abandoned mine or cave, a construction site, dump, or landfill. I don't know if his goal was to get authorities to go and search these types of locations, but there you have it. There was also a letter that Mr. McCullar sent to a Senator, Harry Byrd, asking for assistance in searching for Charles. In it, Mr. McCullar writes about how the FBI refused to help in the matter, stating that they have no authority to enter missing persons cases. This confused Mr. McCullar because he had recently read about the FBI being engaged in a high-profile search for Jimmy Hoffa. Mr. McCullar said that his son deserved that same level of federal assistance that was afforded to the Hoffa family. The FBI responded to such claims in the exact way I would have expected, and it is the same position they always take. They only get involved in a missing persons case if there is reason to believe a kidnapping had taken place, something that was much more likely in the case of Jimmy Hoffa than that of Charles McCullar. Still, the FBI defended their investigation of Jimmy Hoffa because there was an indication that federal statutes other than kidnapping, such as extortion, may have also taken place. Mr. McCullar seemed determined to prove in any way possible that his son's death was not an accident. Before Charles' remains were even found, he was adamant that there was foul play. Here is what he said about the possibility of an accident at that time. In the total lack of any findings during all the searches, that possibility would seem to be all but eliminated. The possibility that remains is that someone was responsible for his disappearance. So basically, the search was unsuccessful. They found nothing, so there must be foul play. But after they found Charles' remains, he still thought it was foul play. As to motive, Mr. McCullar could really offer nothing, since Charles only knew one person in Oregon, and the only thing of any value Charles carried with him was his camera. Mr. McCullar wrote out a list of items that he thought disproved any assumptions that Charles voluntarily disappeared or that he succumbed to the elements, but none of the points he makes actually disprove the possibility that Charles could have died accidentally in any infinite number of ways. If you've watched this channel long enough, you've come to learn that it doesn't matter how experienced of an outdoorsman you think you are. In fact, I would argue it is this experience that actually winds up leading to many deaths. There are few things as dangerous as hubris when it comes to hiking and camping in treacherous wilderness areas. Mr. McCullar actually went as far as to say that he believed there was a possible police cover-up in this case, a notion that was obviously rejected by authorities. As evidence supporting his theory, Mr. McCullar submitted that, why did the state police not contact his home for more information? Was it their prejudice that all 19-year-olds are unreliable, or was there a reason they did not want us to know about this at that time? I can understand Mr. McCullar's frustration here, and he is absolutely right. It probably was exactly as he described. The police probably thought this was some young kid who failed to check in, but that's not a cover-up. That's just biased investigators. Mr. McCullar continues, also, why did the state police make no attempt to check with Greyhound on his bus pass until February 19, 1975? While the bus pass thing is a bit of a blunder, I don't know that it matters overall. Is it unfortunate? Sure. Would knowing what bus Charles caught and at what time change much about this case? Probably not. But I can understand Mr. McCullar's overall point, which is he wants to make sure authorities are doing everything possible as soon as possible in order to find out what happened to his son. He was advocating for his son. He did not believe the case was a big enough priority to them, which may have been true. But was there a cover-up? He doesn't really have any evidence to back that claim. I believe that what Mr. McCullar was encountering here is actually a fairly common phenomenon, and that is, in law enforcement, missing persons work is some of the most despised work to do. Nobody likes to do it. There are a number of reasons for this. Sometimes you investigate till you're blue in the face, but accomplish nothing because everything's a dead end. So you invest a ton of time into something that just remains unsolved. Other times you take the investigation seriously, you put resources into finding someone, and then they pop out of a bush somewhere and say, "Hi, sorry I scared everyone." And the police feel like they wasted a bunch of time and resources on nothing. I'd bet that they were in no great rush to investigate this thing, and instead were waiting to see if he'd just pop out of a bush somewhere. And what choice do you have as a father than to advocate for an investigation yourself? Because I want to make it clear, I'm not trying to tear down Mr. McCullar with all this. I think most people can, in some way, understand the experience of losing a close family member and not knowing what happened. It must be unbearable. But I think Mr. McCullar was also having another issue. He simply did not want to believe that his son, this smart, respectable, hard-working young man, this experienced outdoorsman, could have died in some freak accident in a national park. No, someone had to do this to him. It's something you see every once in a while in a missing persons case, where the only way for a family member to wrap their head around what's happening is to invent a perpetrator. It's not Mr. McCullar's fault. He was obviously suffering, but it's hard to stay unbiased when you are so closely involved with something like this. Now we need to get into the discovery of Charles McCullar's remains. I know I said that the National Park Service lost the records related to Marion Jack and Dave Lang's investigation, which is true, but fortunately for us, I discovered they were not the only ones who held a copy of that report. So let's read about what they found. Almost 2 years after Charles McCullar's disappearance, on October 14, 1976, Tom Gaines and Paul Taylor, two hikers who were visiting Crater Lake National Park from San Antonio, Texas, turned in a set of keys they found while hiking the Oregon Skyline Trail, which today is the Pacific Crest Trail. The area into which they ventured is a rather remote and rugged part of the park, and is not on the Pacific Crest Trail, but it is quite near to it. What their purpose was in wandering off into the woods is unknown, but I suspect they were camping along the Spur Trail, which is a common resting point along the trail for those hiking it. I did read one unconfirmed report that says they accidentally took this spur trail without realizing it was a dead end. While out exploring, they came upon some badly weathered camping gear near Bybee Creek. They rummaged through a backpack they found and removed the keys to turn into park officials. They left the backpack and other items and returned to their camp before finally turning the keys into park headquarters on the 14th. What alerted park officials to the fact that this find may be related to Charles McCullar was a Volkswagen key turned in with the set. That key appeared to match a Xerox of a key held by Charles that was listed among his belongings when he went missing. After learning that the gear may very well belong to Charles, Rangers Dave Lang and Marion Jack were chosen to plan an excursion to recover the items. On October 16th, they set out into the backcountry and the Bybee Creek area. The backpack was apparently located on a ridge north of Bybee Creek. Inside they found an orange pack sack, blue sleeping bag, aluminum canteen, and pipe cleaners. The two rangers did a brief search of the surrounding area, but it was already getting later in the day, so they returned to headquarters. On October 17th, Rangers Jack and Lang set out for the Bybee Creek area once again to search for any other items. This time, they hiked down into the Bybee Creek drainage, and at 11 a.m. they found some clothing on logs at the junction of Bybee Creek with another unnamed creek. They described the clothing as badly weathered and tattered. Some items were draped over a log, and they believed it was the hikers, Tom Gaines and Paul Taylor, who did this. They also believed that this was the location where Gaines and Taylor found the backpack, indicating that the backpack was moved to the top of the ridge by them. They mention a lower leg bone being found with the clothing. The Rangers then searched around the area. 15 feet upstream and 10 feet upslope, they found a human jawbone. Further away from the creek, they found a human skull and what appeared to be a lower leg bone. These bones were found in a flat, wet area at the base of a steep ridge. The slope of the ridge was at a 45-degree angle and composed of very hard material and covered by pine needles. Ranger Lang writes that it was difficult to climb and quite slippery. There were numerous downed trees and standing timber. He remarks that the bones were found at the bottom of this ridge in a wet area adjacent to Bybee Creek. At noon that day, Mary and Jack notified headquarters of his find. They were instructed to take numerous photos and diagrams of the area. Unfortunately, it appears that these photos were completely lost to time. However, Ranger Lang did draw a diagram of the area as he found it. The jawbone and clothing found next to the creek, the skull and long bone found next to the ridge. The Rangers made a list of all items recovered from the scene, including bones, numerous articles, and pieces of clothing, and other miscellaneous items. One thing that was not found was Charles's camera. Its absence was noted in the report. On October 18, 1976, Mr. McCullar received a phone call from authorities that his son's remains had been found the day prior, on the 17th. Mr. McCullar caught a plane that very same day in order to fly out to Oregon and retrieve what was left of his son. On October 19th, a helicopter departed from Salem, Oregon, early in the morning, in order to drop off 2 teams of search personnel who were looking to recover any additional information or evidence in connection with Charles' remains. During this time, photographs of the area were taken, and only 2 survive. Here they are. You can see what the area looks like next to the creek, and also a couple of searchers in the woods. Other than that, we don't get much additional information. Finally, searchers used metal detectors to find some food cans that were previously missed. One of the cans was an opened can of Townhouse fruit cocktail, and the lid from a can of Vienna sausage. They also found an empty package of M&Ms. All of these items were known to be Charles' favorite while hiking. Rotten Levi material, jockey shorts, military-issue long johns, stockings, rolled shoestrings, human hair, bones, and deteriorated fat were found embedded in the bank of Bybee Creek. The only things missing were the camera and accessories, Charles' billfold, jacket, packboard, hunting knives, and his shoes. Authorities believe that due to the evidence, like the opened and eaten food, that Charles was alive for at least a short period of time while at Bybee Creek. At the time he was there, they estimate there was up to 10 feet of snow in the area, covering all the brush and even Bybee Creek itself. Mr. McCullar was taken to the location of the remains on the 19th and was shown the area. There was a note in the files stating that after flying in, he thinks everything is okay, but gave everyone hell on the way things were handled. A pathologist in Klamath County was able to positively identify the mandible and skull as that of Charles McCullar. The pathologist noted that he saw no evidence of damage to the skull other than that caused by the elements and nothing to indicate foul play. On October 21st, all of Charles' things were turned over to Mr. McCullar. Mr. McCullar, for his part, would later give his own description of what was found near Bybee Creek in letters he sent to the FBI months later, and these letters are very important in terms of information. He stated, "There were clothes in his pack. This clothing was in good condition except for holes of the type that would have been made by mice or similar small animals. This clothing had been protected from the weather because deterioration was minimal. The sleeping bag had no rips, such as would be made by claws of a wild animal. Again, the only holes were the type that would be made by small, gnawing animals. The zipper of the bag was in the open, zip-down position. It was found partly in the creek. A foam rubber pad was rolled up and tied. In my opinion, much of that paragraph likely points to the fact that whatever happened to Charles happened while he was on the move and not during a time where he had made camp somewhere. Mr. McCullar continues, "Very careful examination of the soggy, badly deteriorated blue jean remains that were found lying on the bank of the creek revealed not a coin or scrap or anything else in the pockets. There were two zippers practically on top of one another in the closed, zipped-up position. No coins or any other metal objects were reported found at the scene. There were scraps of red fabric and red buttons, and underwear scraps scattered about. None of that is very surprising, though if either of those zippers were from the jeans, that would certainly be notable because it goes against other sources. Let's move on. Many items known to be in his possession were not found. Metal mess kit, 2 knives, aluminum pack rack, camera with leather strap, canisters of film, red waterproof sleeping bag cover, sheet of black plastic. There were no trace of any outerwear, i.e. jacket, ski cap, boots, no billfold or traveler's check folder. Not finding some articles of clothing and boots is so common in these situations that it's not necessarily indicative of anything. These remains were found in an area of flowing water, and also a boggy area. Not ideal circumstances if you're trying to find everything. Empty food containers were found at the scene. He usually adhered to the hiker's credo, don't leave anything except your footprints. It would be typical for him to place empty food containers in his pack after eating. That last meal could have been eaten elsewhere. This is a very good point by Mr. McCullar. He did not fall into the creek. Had he gotten wet, he would have removed the clothes from the pack looking for something dry to put on. While I'm sure this is true, it completely ignores the likely scenario that Charles could have been injured from the fall. Remember, this creek lies at the bottom of a steep ridge. There was no animal attack during nighttime camping. Fair enough. His body lay within inches of the creek, clad in underwear, 2 pair of blue jeans and red shirt, but nothing else. Perhaps socks, but not boots. Everything had been removed from his pockets prior to his body coming to rest on the creek bank. I guess that first part is true in terms of what was found, but we don't know for sure what he was wearing when he died. If he was dying from hypothermia and stuck in this spot, it's possible he could remove clothing by paradoxically undressing. And I would ask Mr. McCullar, how do you know what was in his pockets at the time with enough confidence to say that something had been removed? If something as light as the rolled-up foam rubber pad hadn't washed away, it is likely everything else would have done so. This is not a guarantee. And also, what about stuff being buried in the bog? The metal detectors can only detect buried metal, so we don't know what else is out there that was stuck in the muck. His belt remained in his pack, unmarked and unchewed. If animals dragged away the missing items for their leather content, why not the belt? Fun fact, this statement contradicts the interview with Mary and Jack, who said that the belt was on the jeans, unbuckled. To support that story, the belt is also on a list of items found on scene in the bog, and is not listed as one of the items found in the backpack. Who is correct here? Well, Mr. McCullar was not the one to find the belt, so I'm a bit more skeptical of his version. Maybe Charles had 2 belts, one he wore and a backup he had in his backpack? Who knows? But to answer his question, honestly, if the belt was found in the backpack, I wouldn't be surprised if it was untouched by animals. If it was in the bog and on the pants, maybe it stayed in the bog underwater, whereas the boots didn't. You can't always predict the fate of objects in the wilderness, or especially in water. But ultimately, what is Mr. McCullar getting at with questions like this? That someone killed his son and took his old worn hiking boots for some reason? I get that he has questions, but every case has unanswered questions no matter what, and if you dwell on them, you will go insane. Let's continue. If unknown persons happened onto the site prior to Redacted and Redacted in October 1976 and took away the missing items, wouldn't they dump the contents of the pack, especially while removing the pack rack? Soggy boots and down-filled jacket would be totally useless items to anyone and heavy to carry. I feel like I just made this point. I now firmly realize that Mr. McCullar is not trying to make an argument, he's just raising questions. It's understandable, but they'll likely never be answered. If there was a killer, wouldn't he leave these useless items behind? Yes, he would. So maybe there wasn't a killer. Or maybe there was and he took some items and others got washed away. There's too many variables here and nothing concrete. The FBI actually responded to this letter and said basically the same thing I would have. I am sure that you can understand that in any mysterious disappearance case in which the victim's remains are not discovered until almost 2 years later, that there will always be unresolved questions. The questions that you have asked in your letter are valid. We have considered the same questions. The letter goes on to say that there was no evidence of foul play found, and they're right. There was no evidence of stabbing or gunshots on any of the clothes, or any evidence of blood. You could make the argument that someone gave Charles a bloodless death, but then you are just continuing down a path of unlikelihood. The FBI's response letter goes on to suggest hypothermia as a potential answer to some of these questions, but I am very skeptical of that. He might have died as a result of hypothermia, but I'm unconvinced all of his actions were dictated by it. I doubt he walked into Bybee Creek because he was hypothermic. Once stuck in Bybee Creek, he could have removed articles of clothing because of hypothermia, but that's about as far as I would go with it. The FBI goes on to state that it is unlikely Charles would have been abducted and taken to that remote spot, since the abductors would also have a problem getting out. It's a fair point. There are only a few ways for someone to dump a body in this location, and why would you when there are loads of better options that don't involve getting trapped in the snow? The only easy way to do it would be to fly his body over the spot in a helicopter and then chuck it out, no pun intended. The FBI goes on to say that the case won't be filed away and forgotten, yada yada empty promises. Mr. McCullar writes back, of course, and to speed things up a little bit, I'll highlight parts of the letter I think are relevant. Mr. McCullar states that he conferred with the Crater Lake Chief Ranger, and that he is of the opinion that for Charles to have entered the lake area through the north entrance, his intended route, and proceeded to where his remains were found would have been an impossibility without snowshoes or skis. I find it really fascinating that Mr. McCullar does not want to consider Charles entering through the south entrance here. Mr. McCullar stated in one of his past letters that he believed Charles tried entering through the north on January 30th, but turned back to Diamond Lake where he was potentially seen by another individual there, asking about how far it was to go around the lake. If he attempted to enter through the north once, and it didn't work, why do you assume he would do it again? Why couldn't he try to hitchhike to the south entrance, which is much more accessible? It's something that doesn't make sense to me. Mr. McCullar goes on to state that he made contact with one of the hikers who found the remains, either Gaines or Taylor. They told him that when they discovered the backpack, they also found some socks, a shirt, a pair of blue jeans, and a ring of keys within a foot of the pack. The remainder of the clothes were inside the pack, and the pack was open with broken straps. He assumes they scattered the clothing when emptying the pack. He was also told that 2 cans of chili were found under the pack, which must have been disposed of as they were never found by the investigation team. One thing I was hoping they would have mentioned is the apparent moving of the backpack, because Dave Lang and Marion Jack reported finding it on the ridge north of Bybee Creek. The 2 hikers must have obviously moved it. In his letter, Mr. McCullar goes on to refute any suggestion of hypothermia being a cause, saying that anyone who is already paradoxically undressing would not be able to walk far or carry much weight. And I don't disagree with him, but it doesn't refute the possibility that Charles got stuck in this area and then became hypothermic. Mr. McCullar acknowledges in this letter that there was no visible evidence of foul play, but that it is the lack of evidence, namely the missing items, which has convinced him that foul play was involved. A statement that, in some ways, boggles the mind, because in his previous letter he said he couldn't understand why a killer would take many of these missing items. So a lot of items weren't found. Many of them no one would want. Equals foul play? It's starting to sound like Mr. McCullar is insinuating that Charles was killed by an angry photographer who wanted to steal his camera in the dead of winter, but ended up taking his old boots and other useless items as well. Mr. McCullar continues, when considering the items which are missing, it is indicative that Chuck was bedded down for the night. He would have made shelter with the sheet of black plastic, unrolled his sleeping bag, taken his mess kit out of pack to eat. Before getting into his sleeping bag, he would have removed his jacket, snow shields, boots, bulky items such as knives, wallet, and change. Since it was either snowing or he thought it might snow, he used his waterproof sleeping bag cover to store these items, as well as his camera, film, and slides. I do not believe that these items were ever at the scene where the remains were found. Had this been so, I believe some of the items would have been found. I cannot believe only these items would have washed away with high water, since other items did not get washed away. I believe with additional snows, the camera, after lying there for 4 or 5 months, would have gotten moisture, which would have caused some corrosion. Had anybody found it and taken it away, it would probably have needed some cleaning or repair. In communicating with Aaron Rick Photo Optical Industries, the manufacturer of the camera and lens, their records indicate that none of these items had been returned to their service centers. I think I can see Mr. McCullar's train of thought here. I think he's trying to say that Charles may have been attacked by someone at night when he was asleep. But there are certain things that don't fit. Mr. McCullar was aware that Charles had a foam rubber pad that was found rolled up and tied. He stated those very words in a previous letter. If he was bedded down for the night, why wouldn't he have unrolled and been laying on his pad, which would have been a great barrier to the snow? Having an unzipped sleeping bag is not indicative of Charles having been asleep at the time. The only time I zip up my sleeping bag is when I'm in it. Otherwise, it's just shoved into its bag or backpack. And if Charles emptied his pockets of his wallet, keys, change, etc., and put those things in his waterproof sleeping bag cover, along with his camera, and this bag was never found, then why were his keys found lying near his backpack? Mr. McCullar's scenario only begets more questions, but let's continue. Subsequent to the visit to the scene by the investigating team, I, accompanied by an employee of Crater Lake, returned to the area of the scene by driving eastward to the end of Bybee Creek roadway, and then hiking eastward toward the scene for approximately 3 miles up Bybee Creek bed and the south side of the ridge. On our return trip, we used the trail on the north side of the ridge. It is my opinion that with deep snow on the ground, it would not have been a problem to go into and out of the area by snowmobile. It is also my opinion that to have placed the body and other items found on the scene would not create much of a problem. The northern slope of the creek is steep and devoid of trees. It is also two-tiered. With snow on the ground, any object which started sliding at the top of the slope would go completely across the creek, since the second or lower tier would act the same as if on a ski run. I think this would account for the body having lain so close to the creek. The sleeping bag lying half in the creek, and the impact of landing caused the pack strap to break, thus accounting for only a few items in the pack being on the ground. So Mr. McCullar finally gives us his full theory. He seems to suggest that Charles was jumped sometime at night while he was bedded down, and he was killed. The killer then stole some valuables like his camera, and apparently cleaned up the campsite of things like his sleeping bag, backpack, etc., while also leaving items like his black tarp, which must have been tied to some trees. Anyway, the killer took some things, left others, and loaded the body onto the snowmobile and drove to a remote area where he dumped the body. The body falling down the ridge caused the damage to the pack and the items scattering that was found. I mean, it would be the only way to do it, but it suggests that there was a killer lurking around Crater Lake at night, in the dead of winter, in almost 10 feet of snow. This man then successfully killed Charles without spilling blood and drove the body out to Bybee Creek. But did he do it that night? The next day? If you went the correct route, it might very well be possible to get in there by snowmobile and get back out, but it would be incredibly dangerous. After this, there is some more correspondence between Mr. McCullar and the FBI, where Mr. McCullar appears to learn that the FBI file on his son's death had been closed. The FBI responds that the file is not closed, and they tell him there has never been a shred of evidence to indicate foul play in the case. It's interesting to see the correspondence between Oregon State and the FBI, all of whom received many letters from Mr. McCullar. They write that Mr. McCullar is determined to believe Charles died by means other than accidental. So this is where much of the paperwork ends for this case. Part 2 will be about theories on what could have happened to Charles. So stay tuned for that, and until next time, thanks for watching. And please remember to check out Fxllxng for a great holiday gift. Click the link in the description for a 15% discount on your order.